Less than 24 hours left. We're told that the oxygen supply might be dwindling even further. There was only about 96 hours, at least. That was a conservative estimate, we were told at the very outset of the story when we first heard that Titan had gone missing. Let's bring into the conversation Dr. Sal Mercogliano, Associate Professor of History at Campbell University, an expert in this, and we spoke with him last night. Thanks so much for being with us yet again. I know you are very busy following all this, kind of like we are as well. But I wanted to first up ask you as well. We now know the search area has doubled in size since you and I spoke at this very time last night. When you think of that, does that bode well or not? Does that leave some pessimism in your view, since they have expanded the area of this search? And I want to put up this tweet here from the Coast Guard, because this is kind of hard to decipher. I don't know if you can help us make out this map here. What are we looking at?
Basically laying track lines. So they would have initially scoured that area in the upper left. And what they did was look at the area from where the submersible dropped. And understand, it is 13,000 feet to the bottom. This submersible doesn't have a lot of propulsion, and you're right in the Gulf Stream. So you actually have to let the submersible drop upstream from where the Titanic is, because the Gulf Stream will push it toward where it is. Now, if it aborted its launch and came back up, you wouldn't really quite know where it is on the surface. And even though you search an area of the ocean, you have to come back over it and search it again multiple times, because you may have missed the point where the sound was being emitting or where the object is. And what they're doing now is moving probably along the drift pattern of maybe where the submersible was, if it was either on the surface or just below the surface.
That's so interesting, because we do know now that the search is in the air. The search is also about 2 miles deep, but also on the surface level itself. And I want to talk about the assets being deployed, Sal, but both U.S. Navy assets, Coast Guard assets, but also what the Canadian side is doing too. And I want to see if you're familiar with this system. It's called the Flyaway Deep Ocean Salvage System, otherwise known as FADOSS. It's apparently a motion-compensated lift system designed to provide reliable deep ocean lifting capacity for the recovery of large, bulky, and heavy undersea objects. And the Navy has deployed this. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, it's a salvage system used by the Navy, and the idea is you go down and you would attach it to an object. And there are two ways to get objects up from the deep ocean. And one of them is to attach these lift bags that basically are like big balloons, and you inflate them and you bring them up. But you have to be careful about that, because just using those lift bags, you can flip the object, you can turn it, you can actually lose it. And with the system the Navy has developed is a design to be attached at multiple points, and you can basically control the lift coming up. So it is a salvage system that be used. The worst case scenario would be like trying to attach a cable to it and hoisting it up, because then it's dangling at the end of literally a big fish hook. And this is a much more controllable system, because you don't want the object being dropped again.
Okay, because apparently from some reporting out there, it suggests that it might not get there or be operable in time to even make a difference. Have you seen that?
It may not. It's going to take time to get out there, and they have probably other salvage equipment that's on site that got there. So they would have, be bringing that in, and if they can use it, they will. If not, they'll use the systems they have at hand should they locate the submersible.
Okay, but Sal, let's get to really the news of the day, the item that everyone has really latched onto about these quote-unquote banging sounds, banging noises. That's what the Coast Guard is describing them as. And you were watching the latest press conference from those Coast Guard officials, and from my view, they didn't seem to give much credence into whether or not the sounds would give them any indication of where the vessel might be, but they did literally recenter and refocus some of their search efforts on where those sounds were coming from. And I reached out to some of my Coast Guard sources to see if, we could get some type of audio file or something, just so we can hear what they were hearing. Do you have any more information on that specifically today? Because it seems like they're turning people off from that idea. They don't want people to get their hopes up just from these noises.
Well, as you showed on that chart, and you saw the area they're covering, if you think about it, think about the number of sonobuoys that they're dropping in the ocean. They're not as many, there's not enough ears to be listening to them all the time. And so this goes through computer systems, and they listen for sounds. And then what they'll do is they'll go back and listen to them with human ears, but then they have to crunch the numbers. And that's why the representative from Woods Hole was talking about the data. It's really important that, because even if you hear a metal on metal sound from one sonobuoy, that doesn't really tell you where anything is. It gives you maybe a direction. You need to be able to triangulate that from multiple sources at the same time. And again, the ocean's a loud, noisy place. There's probably things banging up against the hull of Titanic. There are other wrecks down there from the graveyard of the Atlantic from World War I and World War II. And so it's really difficult to be able to pick a noise out. Someone uses the idea of picking out one instrument from a marching band. That's what you're trying to locate.
Okay, so that was news to me, I guess, today, maybe some other viewers, that the ocean is a very, very noisy place, and I think we've established that. But how, at what level of depth do we know even if these noises, these sounds are coming from?
Well, that's the other element you have. I mean, the ocean has a gradient, this temperature gradient.
Sure.
And so you got to get down below that thermal layer to be able to hear it. So again, you're operating in 3 dimensions here, because your sonobuoy floating on the surface or your totes array has to be able to give you a direction. It doesn't just give you a flat 2-dimensional direction. It's got to give you that 3-dimensional direction. And so it's really hard to do it. And plus, sound gets bent in the ocean because of water salinity and density and things like that. Sound doesn't travel in a straight line. And so you have to basically adjust for that. And so what you're always doing is readjusting and trying to triangulate and fix onto a position. It's really difficult. Again, I go back to that issue that most movies you've ever seen with navies and submarines, those submarines operate in fairly shallow water than this, less than 1,000 feet of water. When you're down to 13,000 feet, that's a whole new area. It's like trying to pick a sound out from the bottom of the Grand Canyon.
Wow. Yeah, and we have been talking to submersible pilots, and in the extent, of their experience, they only go 1,500, 2,000 feet below the surface. This mission was attempting to go 12,000, 13,000 feet below the surface as well. I want to kind of pose a theory to you. We had been speaking to some of our other experts about this. One of them had kind of put forth the fact, and this is a theory you've seen circulating out there, that maybe the structural integrity of the vessel itself, possibly the hull, was compromised, and then it went from there. Have you seen that swirling around? Is there credence to that, you think?
I have. When you listen to the way OceanGate talked about this, they didn't do the standard survey of the hull, when they would use measurement devices to ensure that the hull is at a constant, thickness throughout. They were using basically sound and eyesight to be able to determine this. And the problem you have is, as you go deeper and deeper in the water, that pressure increases. And what happens is, if there's any flaw, any ripple, any deficiency so much, the pressure is going to act on that surface inordinately, and what it will do is create the rupture. And that's the fear here, is that because they were operating with this, again, the reason he didn't want to get a classification society, the reason he didn't want the American Bureau of Shipping with their 273-page manual on submersible operations to come in, is because he built this submersible in a much different way than other submersibles have been built. It's not a large metal sphere. It's a tube built out of this kind of unique material. And so to get that certified and how to regulate it and how to ensure there's no deformities on it would require a whole new system in place.
Yeah, and Sal, that was the other thing, and there's been so many questions raised about, the nature of how OceanGate kind of operates this, if this was all above board. And I think I had asked you last night on whether or not, this specific very niche industry needs to take a good hard look internally at themselves about whether or not this is going to be safe going forward and what needs to change, because so many questions are being raised.
Well, that letter you showed from the the Maritime Society that does submersibles.
Yeah.
The big fear in the industry right now, I could tell you, is that legislation is going to come down to basically make it much more difficult to operate submersibles. When submersible operators would tell you, listen, we're following rules and regulations, very stringent ones. We have to be able to operate in the commercial environment for offshore drilling, for laying of cables and pipes. And what they would say is OceanGate isn't, it's the abnormal way of operating. That's not the way we do business. And that's one of the reasons you saw that critique come out from MTS. They really wanted to ensure that OceanGate was following rules, that they were using these entities out there. I think the other element here beyond OceanGate, Horizon Maritime, which operates the Polar Prince, which is a outfit that operates deep water support vessels. They launched this vessel off a Canadian flag vessel with a Canadian crew out of a Canadian port. And I think there's going to be some issues about why Canada wasn't doing oversight over this. Was there inspections of this submersible being done by the Canadian maritime transport areas that do ocean inspections of vessels? Because again, there's a lot of questions being raised now about the operation of this vessel in the kind of international waters.
Yeah. I mean, at this point in time, we do know the hours are dwindling, and the race to find this is getting quite minimal. There's not much time left, is what I'm saying. And so there are kind of three options right now. Find it from the air, find it from the surface, or find it somewhere a little bit below the surface. What's the best mode, if you can even assess that right now, that you think, because you've been following this, do you think there is a chance in one of those three areas more likely than the other?
I think, again, if they were able to shed their weight and pop to the surface, that is the best scenario right now, because that's the quickest recovery operation. They can basically go fish it out, pop the hatch, and get everybody out. That's the thing. If they find them on the bottom and they're intact, you still have the whole process of trying to bring them up, and you're racing against time at that point. If there's somewhere in between there, they weren't able to shed their weight, but again, the way this submersible is designed, it goes up or down. That's it.
Okay.
It should be somewhere in that area, but I think because you're seeing that big presence right now on the ocean, they're still trying to cover the ocean. And once they reach that point, then you get into a recovery operation. And if this submersible suffered a catastrophic failure, to find a crushed submersible is going to be really difficult to find.
Okay. Yeah, and there was, I just thought of this now, because there was another theory kind of also percolating out there, that the submersible, the vessel itself, might have gotten caught in the wreckage of the Titanic and it's stuck. Have you seen that? Would that even be possible? Because from what I understand, you can't get that close to it, right?
Well, I mean, it's like dropping a ping pong ball from the top of the Empire State Building and landing it in a cup. I mean, that's the analogy there. It's really difficult. I mean, this submersible had a hard time finding Titanic when it was on the bottom at some points. They didn't always find it. It's not easy to locate at times. And the idea that they fell and landed on the Titanic, I think, is very unlikely at all.
All right, Sal Mercogliano, just lastly, I mean, we're getting down to the wire here. A lot of people we have spoken to are quite resigned to the fact that this is not going to be a happy ending here, that many have kind of been speaking as if the 5 on board have already perished because they have been there since last Sunday. Is that how you feel right now, or do you have hope still?
There have been submarine rescues in the past, the Squalus off of Portsmouth in 1939, where they found crew on board. Pisces 3 in early 1970s, 2 personnel on board. It was a deep submergence vessel. They were only down at 1,700 feet, but they came up with less than an hour's worth of air left. Again, I go to the very end. Until the point you reach where there's no potential for life to exist, you still treat this as a rescue operation.
All right, and we, like I said, always appreciate your insight, and we'll definitely be speaking again. Thanks so much. Have a good night.
Thanks for having me.